From Connecticut Public Radio in Hartford, this is Audacious. I'm Kyone Wolfe. For most of their life, Pidgeon Pagonis was told a certain story about their birth in 1986.
So when I was 5 or 6, my mom sat me down, and what she told me that day was that I couldn't have a baby when I grew up, and I wouldn't be able to have a period because when I was born, I had cancer, and the cancer resided in my ovaries. And the doctors saved my life and removed my cancerous ovaries.
Pidgeon had a few more surgeries over the years, but later found out that the reason for those surgeries were not made entirely clear to them or their family. And when they later pieced together the full picture, some explanations by hospital staff felt like outright lies. But the biggest revelation happened when they were in college. In a psychology of women class, Pidgeon learned about the ways that being intersex can show up in a human. And they began checking so many boxes. Intersex people are born with reproductive or sexual anatomy outside the typical male-female binary. But there's no one way to be intersex. And as you'll hear, historically, medical convention has been that intersex variations should be quote-unquote corrected by all means to make genitalia appear more typically male or female. That included medically unnecessary surgeries during infancy or before a child can consent. Pidgeon Pagonis is now an activist, educator, and filmmaker, and the author of the memoir, Nobody Needs to Know. Today, you'll hear about what it was like discovering what really was done to their body in surgery, what their actual intersex condition is, and how they successfully got the hospital where it all happened to change their policies on how they do and do not treat intersex children. And a quick heads up, this episode does discuss body parts and experiences that may not be appropriate for young children. Here's Pidgeon talking about the sadness around what they thought was surgery to remove cancerous ovaries and around not being able to have a period or children later in life.
I remember attempting to cover up that sadness or to just sort of bury it as best as I could. But I always had that secret or that pain. It made me feel, it's the first time I felt different than anyone else. The second thing that would happen is I was having some issues going pee, and I told my mom. And soon after, there was a bunch of doctor's appointments set up. And one of them was an exploratory procedure where they put a camera up my urethra towards my bladder and decided and discovered that I had a problem with my urethra. And that's why I had a urinary problem. And that they told me they were going to fix my urethra. And I went under surgery, and I woke up from that surgery thinking I had a new fixed urethra.
And how old are you at this point?
I was 11. I was either 10 and a half or 11. I was in 5th grade. I had just learned about sex ed too. Like I was just going into sex ed and learning about the biological differences of boys and girls and how our bodies look and this and that.
And let me guess, just boys and girls.
Yes, just boys and just girls. And I thought I was just a girl at that time. And right before I went under the anesthesia, two doctors or one doctor, one of them, somebody came in my room and introduced themselves to me as one of the surgeons that day and told me that during the exploration process of the urethra, they also noticed that my vagina was a little bit smaller than other girls. And while they were in there doing the surgery, they recommend that I let them do a little incision in my vagina, my vaginal opening, to make that vaginal opening a little bit bigger. So that when I was older, when I was an adult and I was in a marriage, I could have sex with my husband. And I gave consent
at 10 or 11, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then I went under the surgery, came up, thought I had my urethra fixed, but I also thought, now I guess my vagina is bigger too. I was in the hospital for about 5 to 7 days. And during that visit or that stay, I had a lot of doctors visiting me and residents. And they would kind of just come in and look at the wound or the healing site, as they might call it, between my legs. They might have even said, "Is it okay if we take a peek?" I think they always said peek. And I think I probably gave consent and said yes. I think that was part of my way of believing that, or trying to make believe that I was okay and I was strong and nothing, this wasn't affecting me. And it's part of being like a people pleaser, I think. But I noticed, everyone around me is going through puberty, and I wasn't. At least the signs that I could see, I wasn't developing like breast tissue or hips, and I wasn't getting a period, which I already knew I wasn't going to get, but I was more aware of it than ever because everyone else was getting a period. And we went to the doctor, and and they said, well, you're gonna take these pills. Since we took your ovaries out when you were a baby, you can't go through a normal puberty without these pills. These pills are going to be like your ovaries. They're going to produce the same things your ovaries would have. And the pills ended up being estrogen. And that was like the third big thing in my life where I realized I'm different and everything is kind of different for me. And then I got to high school and I got a boyfriend. And that was the first time I attempted to have sex with somebody. And after 2 or 3 tries, it became apparent that sex was very difficult. I couldn't have it. It wasn't working.
Penetrative sex.
Yeah, the penetration wasn't penetrating. And again, I felt so lost and so different and so isolated than my peers and that in society, because you grow up in a society, you see sex everywhere, you know what it is. And I'm just like, I couldn't do it. There was a time eventually, I think after the third time, where I was able to have penetrative intercourse with my boyfriend. And it hurt. And I brushed it off and said, okay, it's supposed to hurt. I read that it hurts the first time. And each time it hurt and it never stopped hurting. And then eventually we had done it so often at a certain point that the hurt stopped hurting. And instead it was replaced with numbness. And that hurts in a different way, to be disconnected from your body in that way. But I preferred it over the pain. And I kept participating in that because I thought that, or I felt somewhere in some level of me, on some level, I felt that if I could do this, if I can exist in this practice of sex with my boyfriend, if I could participate in that, that was somehow proof that I was okay and I was normal. Meanwhile, everything in my life had told me I wasn't normal, like the experiences, but the people in my life kept telling me I'm normal, you're normal. Every doctor, my parents, everything's you're fine, you're fine, you're fine, you're normal, you're normal, normal. Don't tell anybody though. So
don't tell anybody how normal you are.
Exactly. And so I think, it's kind of impossible not to internalize that you're not normal and that something is not normal. But I stayed quiet, just like they told me. I didn't speak of the fact I couldn't even have a period to my boyfriend. I remember pretending I had a period at certain points in the relationship just to A, look normal, and B, to avoid having sex for a week or so, or a few days, each month. But I like other people, I got through high school and I went to college. And one day I'm sitting in my first year of college and I'm sitting in a class called Psychology of Women. And I see a slide on the projector slide, and it said, androgen insensitivity syndrome. Some women are born with this condition. A lot of these women have traits such as being very tall, having very clear skin, not having a lot of pubic hair or underarm hair or any at all, large breasts. Sometimes they're models because they're tall and they're traditionally like very feminine and I'm just like, this is interesting, like what are we learning about? And then there's these other bullet points on that slide, and one of them said, these women have XY chromosomes. These women don't have periods. These women can't reproduce. And that is the moment where things started to shift into focus for me. I felt something, you feel something, you're like,
So you're like sitting in the middle of class,
mm-hmm.
surrounded by a bunch of people in your Psychology of Women 300 class.
Yeah.
And your gears start turning. What was your next step? Googling, talking to the teacher?
No, I went home. I went to my dorm and I called my mom. I was 18 at that point. And when you're 18, you get discharged from a children's hospital. So my whole life, I had grown up going to a children's hospital, which was actually across the street from my university. And I knew that because I was 18, they were discharging me and wanted me to find a gynecologist, an adult for adults. So I called my mom and I said, remember when, is there paperwork that they sent you? I think I heard about paperwork so that we could give it to the new doctor and this and that. And I said, Mom, can you pull that paperwork out and tell me what it says? Like, is there anything like a diagnosis, or is there, and she found the paperwork and she started looking at it. And I remember she said the words androgen insensitivity syndrome, which is the same exact word I had just seen in class on that slide.
Oh, wait a minute. So did your mom know the whole time? What did she know?
According to my mom, she and my pediatrician noticed something. And the pediatrician sent me to specialists at Children's Hospital, Lurie Children's. And around the age of 6 months old, those doctors ran some tests on me and discovered I had XY chromosomes. But I was assigned female at birth. So those two things didn't line up. I'm unaware if they clearly told my mom that I had XY chromosomes. I believe they may have kept that to themselves, but I'm not sure. What they did tell my mom and my dad was that I was their daughter and everything was okay, but I was born with underdeveloped ovaries, or they would sometimes use the word gonads. And that if left intact, I would grow up and almost surely develop cancer in those underdeveloped ovaries. So the doctors presented me to my parents as an underdeveloped female, slightly like undercooked chicken in the oven. And they needed to just tweak a few things, to get me on the way, all the way to being a developed female child. And one of those things that they needed to do, they recommended, was to remove my underdeveloped ovaries or my gonads. And that makes me kind of remember that I don't think they did tell my parents I had XY chromosomes, because I wasn't born with underdeveloped ovaries. I was born with undescended testes. And so they didn't use those words with my parents. They didn't use testes. They wanted my parents to also believe the myth as well. And so my parents believed I had these underdeveloped gonads or ovaries that would turn into cancer later in life. So they agreed to the first surgery I had when I was 11 months old to allow the doctors to remove those underdeveloped ovaries.
Which were really undescended testes.
Which were really undescended testes. And so my parents agreed, thinking they were saving, doing the best thing for their child.
But they were also lied to.
Yeah. It's part of the protocol back then was to not actually tell the parents every single thing, because they thought parents couldn't handle it and they thought that it would affect how they raised their child, meaning they wouldn't raise their child in the binary sex that the doctors were telling them that their child was.
So how did things unravel from there when you're standing there with your mom and the paperwork and you see AIS, androgen insensitivity syndrome?
So after that, I go on the internet and I do some research about AIS, or androgen insensitivity syndrome. And I find this term intersex. And I find out that androgen insensitivity syndrome is one of the variations or the conditions that falls under the umbrella term intersex. And intersex, I find out, is a term for people born somewhere in between male and female, or kind of outside of that paradigm as we think of it to exist. And I cry a lot at this point. And I stay in bed a lot, and I'm staying up late, just kind of Googling everything I can.
Well, wait a minute. When you're crying, I imagine that's a different kind of crying than the kind of crying you'd been doing as a child and as a young adult leading up to this point. What were you crying about? What was in there?
I think at first I was just shocked that I had XY chromosomes. I was in a very binary frame of understanding at that point about the world and about gender. And I had found out from my research that I was not probably born with ovaries, that I was born with undescended testes. So I felt really lied to. And I felt like life up until that point was constructed for me, and it was constructed as a lie. And something about that just felt very sickening to me, or very gross, that I had went through my life not even knowing that I had XY chromosomes and undescended testes. I just really believed, oh, I was born a boy. And everybody just changed me into a girl and lied to me for what they thought was my own good. I felt a lot of shame. Again, a different kind of shame, because I didn't know this before.
That was Pidgeon Pagonis, intersex speaker, filmmaker, and consultant, and author of the memoir, Nobody Needs to Know. When we get back, after Pidgeon requests their records from the hospital where they had all those procedures, the truth finally comes out.
It's like the worst homecoming you could ever have. It's like you're coming home, you figure things out, you finally realize what's going on, and you find other people just like you, and you want nothing to do with that truth.
But then, find out how they teamed up with other people in the intersex community to successfully change hospital policies. I'm Kyone Wolf. This is Audacious. Stay with me. This is Audacious. I'm Kyone Wolf. Intersex activist Pidgeon Pagonis named their memoir Nobody Needs to Know for a reason. Growing up, those were the words doctors would tell them surgery after surgery. Nobody needs to know that they take estrogen, that they won't be able to have a period, that they won't be able to give birth to children. In 2004, at 18 years old, Pidgeon learned the truth about their medical history. The story they were told about their birth, that they were born with cancerous ovaries, wasn't true. Pidgeon was born with undescended testes, a common trait of people with androgen insensitivity syndrome, a condition under the intersex umbrella. Pidgeon felt anger, shock, and sadness. And I wanted to know who or what exactly were those feelings aimed at.
Well, okay, so at this point, I still kind of just know the tip of the iceberg of the truth. And I think I found a support group online, which still exists today. And this support group was specifically for people with androgen insensitivity syndrome. It was a Yahoo group back in the day. And I remember requesting to join this text-based forum online called New Rare Orchids Support Group. Very weird name. I think it might have said for women with androgen insensitivity syndrome. But to join, you had to tell your story in a Word document and then submit it. And then the moderators would read your story and see if you really were a woman with androgen insensitivity syndrome to get in. So I was allowed in after I shared my story. And once you get into this group, you get to see the master or the file. There's a file in the group in the file section. that has everyone else's entrance stories in one Microsoft Word document that's really long. And I remember reading these stories, and so many of them were like mine. Like 80% of them, these people were told they had cancer in their ovaries when they were born. That's why they have a scar in their body. They couldn't have a period. They wouldn't be able to have children. Don't worry, you can adopt. Take these pills. Shut up, everything's going to be fine. Don't tell nobody. And story after story is are of people finding out the truth later in life.
What was that like?
It's like the worst homecoming you could ever have. It's like you're coming home. You figure things out. You finally realize what's going on. And you find other people just like you. And you want nothing to do with those people. And you want nothing to do with that truth. You don't want to be at this homecoming. You want to go back to like the fantasy that everything's fine. At this point, I'd rather take like my high school version of myself when I didn't know anything and I was just drinking away my pain. It was like a nightmare. And I didn't want it to be true. At another point of this time in my life, I go to my teacher who had taught me about androgen sensitivity syndrome. And I sat down with her after class and I said, Professor, that thing you taught us about AIS, I went home after we learned and I found out that I have that thing, that I have that condition. And I was crying. And she told me that she was having a speaker come to class to speak about being intersex. And that she was part of this thing called ISNA, the Intersex Society of North America. And they had a speakers bureau and she was one of their speakers. She lived in Chicago, which is where I went to school and lived. And that she was going to come to class. And if I would like, we could get pizza after class so I could talk to her one-on-one. And I heard her share her story in class. And again, I didn't want to be associated with her. I didn't want to believe that I was intersex. I didn't want this to be true. But she encouraged me to say I was intersex out loud. She was a very proud intersex person. And she did a lot of work to reclaim that. And she wanted me to start on that journey. So I remember at that meeting where we got food together, she was just like, you need to say you're intersex. Have you said it yet? And I was like, I was like, no. And when I did say it, she's like, say it. I was like whispering it. And then I just didn't. It's like, there's people in this pizza place. They might hear, like, I'm in school. They might be at my school with me. Like, I just was like, can you calm down? And, but she gave me this piece of advice. And this is something I read about in that group. She said, go get your medical records. And a lot of women or people in that support group would talk about how they couldn't get their medical records, how they were burned in a fire, quote unquote. Off or misplaced every time they went to the hospital. Seemingly, for some reason, every person with AIS they couldn't find their medical records. So I take her advice and I go to the hospital. I cross the street, literally just have to cross the street from my college, walk to the basement of a hospital I'm very familiar with. I've been there a million times.
This is Lurie Children's Hospital?
Yeah, it used to be in a different location across the street from my school. And I go to the medical records department in the basement, which was the advice of every intersex person or every person with androgen insensitivity syndrome I'd met, that said, don't tell your doctors that you're trying to get your records. Go to the actual department and just pay for them out of pocket. Like, don't bring your doctors in, because if you go to the doctors, yes, it could be free, but they have the chance to know that you're looking for them and they can maybe change stuff or delete stuff, or they might get lost in a fire, quote unquote. And so I went to the downstairs and I applied for, I tried to buy my medical records or get them. And I remember just weeks going by and I never got them. And I was starting to get worried, like, what's going on? And I remember following up back in person. I went back in person. And I remember the person behind the desk, this time was completely different. The first time it was like, which actually now kind of worries me, but anyways, but the first time it was like, oh, it's going to take time or whatever, we'll call you. And then this time it was like, oh, 1 second. And they just turn around, they find my file, they make photocopies of it, hand it to me still hot off the Xerox machine. I take it back to my dorm and I start reading page by page. And I called Linnell, was the person's name who spoke at my class. And I read the first page and it said 46XY male pseudohermaphrodite, female testicular feminization syndrome. I remember that was one of the first things I read about myself in my medical records. And this is going to all tie into who I was mad at. That kind of hit me hard. especially the words male and hermaphrodite. And the story of my life starts to get told to me through my medical documents, things I never had been told. One was that, there was something, my vagina in my labia as a kid, or my vulva, that triggered something in my pediatrician to send me to those specialists. I think they used the word swollen. My mom said that they used the word swollen. Things look swollen down there. And they said that my, whatever. So then they say, okay, then the parents bring the kid here to Children's and we run the test. And then we find out they have 46 XY chromosomes. And we suspect they have testicular feminization syndrome, which is the old term for androgen sensitivity syndrome. And that they suggest they run a biopsy before I'm 11 months old. And we ran the biopsy and we discovered this kid's gonads were testicular in nature. The tissue was testicular. And we didn't tell the parents, we tell them, your kid has gonads and these gonads you're going to turn into cancer if we don't take them out. The parents agree. And we took out their testes. So that's all before I'm 11 months old. So I was kind of like, okay, that's probably when they told me they took out my ovaries. That made sense to me in a way. I was like, that's probably that ovary surgery where they saved my life. But I find out from my medical records, I actually had testes. And this feeling of being a girl and thinking I had testes was really not sitting well with me. It was like, I was really like mortified by it.
One other really big changing point for you was when Linnell, who was the guest speaker in that class, that first intersex person you met, was invited to speak with other intersex people on Oprah. And Linnell invited you to be their guest in the audience. You said it changed the trajectory of your life. Tell me about it.
At this point, I had not told anybody that I was intersex. And I seen these intersex people be really brave and kind of just share their story. And I was blown away because I was like, I could never do that. But when I saw them do it, something changed in me and a possibility unlocked. And the possibility was that like, maybe it's not so scary, or maybe it's not so bad to share my story with people. Maybe I want to be like them one day. After that day, I started to share my story more, maybe with my friend, like one of my best friends. And I found a new program at school called Women in Gender Studies. And I started to research the topic more and find out about the history of it all. And I started to talk about it in class. And I made my thesis project about it and about intersex. And I interviewed intersex people who started the movement. Some of them started the movement for intersex justice. I interviewed them and I interviewed other people. And I told my story in that thesis as well. And then on my last day of college, maybe 2 years after the Oprah episode or 3, I shared a portion of my thesis, which had my story in it, to a room full of mostly like parents of fellow students. And my family was there. And that was the first time I kind of publicly shared it to a room of people versus like a friend or a partner. That kicked the ball off, I think is the phrase, to a lifetime now since then of public speaking on this topic, speaking to the media about this topic, working in nonprofits, starting my own organization one day, and eventually writing my story as a memoir in this book, Nobody Needs to Know.
You were featured on StoryCorps out of WBEZ Chicago, and folks there heard you tell a little bit about your story of discovering that you were intersex. And then you got a call from the hospital where all of your surgeries happened, Lori. Can you tell me about that, please?
I got a few calls, but eventually, like it was the hospital kind of freaking out at first. It was like the PR department at first, but then it was a representative from the gender development clinic who was like, "I'm sorry about that other call. We would love to meet with you, and talk about your experience here and like da 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 da." And so at the time, I was working at a nonprofit, an intersex nonprofit called Interact, which is the only legal nonprofit in the country that's dedicated to fighting for the rights of intersex people, and still is. And my boss at the time, who started the organization and who is a lawyer, I told her about that. And she said that she was going to come with me to support me. But we didn't tell them that she was coming. And then they come in, the surgeon, Dr. Earl Chang, and the clinic coordinator, Jennifer Leininger. And they said, well, like, what do you guys want? Da, 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 da. And, we're not willing to stop the surgeries, but what else do you want? And we're not willing to apologize. And I said, like, we would like to give a training. I was in charge of a youth program at Interact at that point. I was like, we'd like to give you guys a training at your clinic. And they agreed to that and they let us do that. But that didn't change any of their practices.
That was Pidgeon Pagonis, intersex speaker, filmmaker, and activist, and author of the memoir Nobody Needs to Know. We'll have a link to their book and to Lurie Children's Hospital's statement about their current policies on intersex care at ctpublic.org/audacious. After the break, how Pidgeon sees the big picture.
So many other cultures have acknowledged that not only gender, but sex exists on a spectrum. And that's the world that we need to push for.
I'm Kyone Wolf. This is Audacious. Stay tuned. This is Audacious. I'm Kyone Wolf. As a kid, Pidgeon Pagonis was kept in the dark about their medical history, including the fact that they were intersex. Between 1987 and 1997, they went through several surgeries on the reproductive system and genitals at what is now Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago, all to make pigeons seem more, quote-unquote, typically female. Years later, Pidgeon got a hold of their medical records and saw the full scope of what was done to them. And then they eventually met with leadership from the hospital where it all happened. They hoped the hospital executives would apologize, to commit to ending medically unnecessary surgeries on intersex children, and to create a fund to pay reparations to any intersex child who went through what Pidgeon went through. Hospital leadership told Pidgeon that they wanted to do better for intersex kids, but the meeting didn't end with any promises of change. Let's get back to our conversation. I want people to read your book, Nobody Needs to Know, to get this whole story. But after this meeting, you began teaming up with other people who are leaders in the intersex community to rally for a stop to the surgeries like the ones you had. Will you talk about what came out of that?
In 2015 or 2016, I worked with Linnell Stephanie Long, the first intersex person I met back in the day, and Sean Seifa-Wall, who was on the board at Interact, and we formed a new group called Intersex Justice Project. We looked back at the history of intersex activism, and we realized that people stopped protesting back in 1996. And there wasn't an intersex protest that we knew of since then. So we formed with the idea of bringing intersex activism back to the streets and incorporating an element of direct action and protest again. And so soon after we formed in 2015 or 2016, we started doing protests at Lurie Children's Hospital with the main demand. We had 3 demands. End intersex surgery was the main demand. Number 2, apologize. And number 3, create a reparations fund for the survivors of what you have done to patients at your hospital so that we can access care that we need. Oh, and there was another big thing that happened. Internally, doctors that worked in that gender development clinic, which was, again, the one that sees trans and intersex patients, a doctor named Dr. Ellie Kim came to a few of our protests during the past few years, and eventually one day spoke out that summer in 2020 on Twitter and called for the end of the surgeries, said that they supported our campaign and asked others to sign our petition and to speak out. And that was the first time I ever heard of or knew of a doctor that worked in a hospital where these surgeries were happening that spoke out against them. So with all that pressure building, we got a call that Lurie decided to make a statement that they were going to end the surgeries, and they apologized for the harm that they caused to people throughout the years. But they didn't say anything about helping us financially or starting a reparations fund for our medical care. But That was a big moment. That was the first time that a hospital in the US apologized.
So I'm clear, in a perfect world, is it fair to say that no hospital would ever make any physical changes to anybody born intersex?
Yeah, of course. If a child needs a surgery to save their life or to help with a very like pressing health issue, like by all means do that. But the surgeries that are done to intersex children, the surgeries that are plastic and like plastic surgeries, these are not necessary. And those surgeries should always be delayed, in my opinion. And not even delayed because I think that implies the need for them. And I'm big on reminding people that these are not even necessary. So they don't even need to be delayed.
Being intersex is not a pre-existing condition.
Yeah. Being intersex is not a pre-existing condition. Being intersex is pathologized, but it shouldn't be. There's nothing pathological about being intersex. It's as Cheryl Chase once said, or Beau Laurent, they go by Beau Laurent today. Intersex is not a medical emergency, but it's treated as a social emergency. And that social emergency is that this belief in our society that an intersex child with a body that is not clearly male or not clearly female can simply not exist in the binary world that we live in. So in a perfect world, or in a just world, I would say all people, whether they're women who are seeking abortions, people who are considered disabled, just children in general, and intersex kids would all have autonomy over their bodies and be able to make decisions themselves that they can actually give informed consent to. It would be their decision.
Yeah, I think a lot of people listening to this may be making the correlation between what you went through and what some intersex kids have gone through, and also be thinking about trans kids. And, if I imagine you being told that you have to have the surgery at 10 or 11, I think, well, what about a trans kid who's miserable and wants some gender affirming surgery? Feels like gender affirming surgery would save their life. Um, to someone not thinking deeply, they may think, oh, you're against surgery for all kids, and kids can't make up their minds, but that's not the nuance you're talking about.
Yeah, no. In the 1950s, there was this doctor named John Money out of Johns Hopkins. He actually studied intersex people, and it was it was his thesis in school. He was pretty well versed in our existence, that intersex people are born and this is what it is and this and that.
As common as redheads.
Yes, 1 in 2,000 births, and he had seen a bunch of us, this and that. But he was a sexologist, not a medical doctor, like not an MD. And he believed that we were a social emergency, our bodies, and that we did need to get forced into a binary box of male or female with surgery. And it had to be done as soon as possible. And it always had to be done before the age of 2, because he believed we had a sense of plasticity in our brains, and with gender especially, and that plasticity lessened after the age of 2, and children start to remember things after the age of 2. And so he developed this protocol that was meant to meet the social emergency of an intersex body. And that protocol was, first, identify the child as intersex or not. So if it is, then tell the parents as little as possible of the truth. And then the doctors were supposed to make a decision of what that child should be raised as, either male or female, based off of their thinking. And coincidentally, the thinking usually ended up saying that child should be raised as a female or as female. And I say coincidentally because I think it was John Money who is famous for saying it's easier to dig a hole than build a pole when it comes to genital surgeries. And because of the constraints in surgery techniques at the time and still today, but less so today, it was easier to do a vaginoplasty on a baby than to do a phalloplasty and create a phallus. So most intersex kids, surprise, surprise, I think it's like over 90%, got assigned female by these doctors, whether or not they were assigned female at birth. And so John Money's protocol became the protocol that I would say a lot of intersex people came in contact with after the 1950s. Now, these are surgeries, and also not just surgeries, but that when the kid grows up, hits puberty, you also then give them the appropriate hormones, which always ended up usually being feminizing hormones like estrogen. And you never tell the kid the truth. That's the three protocol. The three pillars of his protocol was shame, secrecy, and surgery. And I think the way that we need to then navigate this issue, which kind of feels like a two sides of a coin topic. Well, if you're saying, Pidgeon, that intersex kids shouldn't have surgeries done to them, then what do you say when a trans kid wants to have surgery? It comes down to bodily autonomy. These same procedures that were developed by John Money that are forced on intersex kids, that are completely covered by medical insurance, that parents more or less seem to have less stigma about, or less hurdles and obstacles in getting, which is all by design because society and the doctors want to push us intersex people with naturally, I argue, naturally non-binary bodies in terms of our biological sex into a quote unquote binary designation or existence, are the same procedures and the same hormone pills made by the same manufacturers and developed by the same guy, John Money, which has now trickled down to many other surgeons. These protocols are the same things that are being denied from trans people that are consenting and that want these things. And so why is it that a group of people who actually wants these things, who need these things, who've experts time and time again, doctors, physicians, academics, researchers, have shown time and time again ad nauseum that these are life-saving procedures for this group of people when I'm talking about trans people, trans youth, trans young adults, etc. Why are they denied the autonomy from these things? These same things that are forced on intersex kids and no one bats an eyelash. And these are things that intersex people, since the first batch, had grown up since the 50s, and John Money had gone underneath his protocols, grown up and grew up and became adults in the 90s. And ever since that first batch of kids grew up, have been adamantly and vehemently opposed to these surgeries, these non-consensual surgeries from happening, being forced upon intersex people such as themselves. This is a global issue that that activists have started advocating for in the 90s and have never once changed their tune, have always been resolved in their fight for justice and in saying these surgeries rob people of our bodily autonomy. They rob us of our bodily autonomy and they need to end. And if there's ever a surgery in anyone's life that's cosmetic, that's plastic in nature, that should be a person's decision that they can consent to, and not the type of consent that they tricked me into believing I gave when I was 11, which is not telling the person the whole story, not providing them alternatives, not introducing them to the support groups that exist so they can meet other intersex people who have had these surgeries and can give their experiences with them, or can meet other intersex people who slipped through the cracks and didn't get the surgeries and can tell you their experiences. And surprise, surprise, they love having their organs inside of them and they love having their genitalia intact without scar tissue and nerve damage. Not that kind of fake consent. I'm talking about real informed consent that is actually invested in treating the person, the patient, quote unquote, treating them as an expert on their own lives, as worthy of having autonomy over their own body, as somebody to trust in this medical encounter that happens when an intersex person is placed, or their family encounters a doctor or a physician or a surgeon. Intersex people, we don't need surgeries to live happy, healthy lives. What we need is just a little bit more understanding that bodies, human bodies, exist on a spectrum when it comes not just to gender, but biological sex. And this has been the case since the beginning of humanity. And we are very unique in this culture, this society, Western, European rooted society, that we don't acknowledge this rich diversity, this spectrum, this beautiful richness and vastness that biological sex actually exists within. So many other cultures and places and times have acknowledged that not only gender, but sex exists on a spectrum. And I think that's the world that we need to push for, because it's not only going to lead to more autonomy for intersex people, but also for trans people. And then if there's more bodily autonomy for us, there could be more bodily autonomy, hopefully for everybody. Like, people, period, should have autonomy over their bodies. And children should be respected and given autonomy over their bodies. And people that are labeled disabled as kids should be given autonomy. People with neurodivergence should have autonomy. We should be always striving for a brighter, more just, more free, more liberating, more equal society for our children and for ourselves and for the future.
Well, Pidgeon Pagonis, thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you so much, Kion.
You can find a link to Pidgeon's book, Nobody Needs to Know, and to Laurie Children's Hospital's full statement about their current policies on intersex care at ctpublic.org/audacious. There, you'll also find resources to learn more about being intersex, including a link to Interact, Advocates for Intersex Youth. This episode was lovingly produced by Jessica Severin DeMartinez, Khalil Rahman, Meg Fitzgerald, Meg Dalton, and Katie Tolarski at Connecticut Public Radio in Hartford, with help from our intern, Raynette Chefu. If you like this episode, listen to one we did about medical malpractice, where we talk with people who discover their fertility doctor is their biological father. And check out my conversation with Zen monk and non-binary best-selling author and activist, Jeffrey Marsh. And you can hear an episode featuring a conversation about what it's like being a trans woman in the trucking industry. You can find them at ctpublic.org/audacious, and you can listen to them all wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like more people to know that this show exists, which I totally do too, you can team up with us on Apple Podcasts. Just click on all of those stars and write down what it is you love about this show. It really does help the non-feeling almighty algorithm to feel like maybe showing us off. You can stay in touch with me on the socials at Kion Wolf, and you can always send an email to audacious@ctpublic.org. Thanks for listening.